Here we have the wonderful Rebecca Weston, who is the co-president of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and she is a full-time licensed clinical social worker. We met back in April at the Society of Environmental Journalists Conference in Boise, and so yeah, just felt that we needed to chat further. So thank you, Rebecca, for joining me today for this wonderful chat that we're about to have.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it and appreciate the work you do very much.
So break it down for me and for folks who will be watching this. What is climate psychology?
That's a great question. And I think the first way I want to start it is that climate psychology belongs in a long tradition of what I think of as witnessing professionals. Robert J. Lifton had spoken about, who's a psychiatrist, who had spoken out and frequently about the Vietnam War, had spoken out about nuclear weapons, and has also written a book about climate. And he talks a lot about what is a witnessing professional. And a witnessing professional is one who quite literally bears witness to the suffering that the world brings on people, the oppressive systems, the oppressive institutions, and how that impacts us in our internal and external worlds, and how professionals both historically have been on the side of resistance to some of those institutions, but also historically have sometimes been on the side of enabling those institutions. And institutions of oppression, institutions of normalization, institutions of repression, things like that. And climate psychology belongs, in my view, very firmly in the camp of a witnessing professional that stands as one of its obligations to witness the harm being caused by any number of institutions and systems that are so interwoven with the climate crisis, but can be summarized by the climate crisis. Within that, there's a number of different ways that I think about climate psychology as being a witnessing profession. And the first one is that we actually quite literally bear witness to the mental health impacts of extreme climate change. And extreme weather events, ranging from the mental health impacts of drought, the mental health impacts of fire, the mental health impacts of flooding and hurricanes, and all of the sequelae of that, the homelessness that happens, the lack of shelter, the lack of livelihood, the lack of security, and then the differential impacts, how that affects women more if they're in shelters and there's an increase in violence, and the mental health impacts of that. So there's all sorts of immediate, very specific impacts of extreme weather events all over the globe. And then how those play out in intersectional ways on different populations with different histories and different geographies. That's one big part of what climate psychology does. And that includes research, it includes talking, it includes lecturing, it includes getting the information out to journalists, for example, about those things. There's another part of it, though, that also tries to explain and understand and address the ways in which ordinary people living their daily life are impacted by extreme climate and climate distress, climate anxiety. So certainly there's climate trauma that we've just been sort of referencing, but then also, how is it that we can understand why it looks like there's business as usual? How do we understand how it is that we can be living at a planetary crisis and go on about our daily lives, that politicians are going on about their daily lives? How do we emotionally and psychologically grapple with that reality, that there is something so profoundly terrifying happening, and yet so many of us walk around during the day acting as if it's not? And how do we understand that? And in my field, at least the way I approach that, I do not think of that in behavioral terms. I think about that in terms of fear, overwhelm, disavowal, afraid to acknowledge it, afraid because we don't know how to address it, feelings of guilt, feelings of shame. So all of the emotional aspects that go into why it looks like there's apathy when in fact there's tremendous amounts of care but it's hard to tap because people don't quite know what to do, especially thanks to the fossil fuel industry about, the ideas that they generate. And I guess the third thing that climate psychology does, in my view, is it tries to understand the dangers if we don't address this psychologically, if we don't address people's anxieties and fears and overwhelm. And it's not rocket science to see the rise in authoritarianism and the rise in anti-immigrant hysteria and the rise in fascist movements, I think are both directly and indirectly related to the deep sense of ill at ease, the deep sense of insecurity, and the territorial and tribal attempts to protect what one has at the expense of other people, I think is only growing. The murders in Buffalo had a very clear eco-fascist through line. And I believe that's only going to get worse if we don't figure out a way to address the mental health as well as the policy aspects of climate change.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think what you said in the first part of your answer sort of really resonated, because I think sometimes, I think defining it as witnessing professional is really interesting, because I sort of always think of journalists as like griots, sort of that term, and then sort of like record keepers, but also I think what you just said, a deeper aspect of that storytelling and record keeping, sort of witnessing. Yes, I think you're very right. Not just reporting with and for on these issues, but also like seeing it and experiencing it in sort of like an empathetic way as well. And yeah.
I would add to the idea of witnessing. I used to be a lawyer, so this is sort of maybe why is witnessing is also to attest, to speak out.
Yeah.
It's not just a quiet process. It's not just a being with and experiencing process. It's also proclaiming and naming. And
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the ways in which climate psychology is different from how other people experience psychology is that I think it needs to be an active voice. It needs to be active and out there and get this information and be on the side of human survival, on the side of compassionate and sustainable and socially just ways of addressing the crisis. So witnessing is in both ways. It's witnessing the pain, but it's also witnessing in terms of attesting and speaking out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think your point about the rise in sort of militia groups and all these things that are happening. Yeah, I think it's sort of a lot of things that are compounding, but I think folks don't recognize how they're all sort of interrelated. I definitely think, this food crisis, water crisis, energy crisis, this sort of, I think, sort of questioning about the legitimacy of our government and state. I think all of those things definitely play into it. And I don't think, I think if you're not actively thinking about it, it can present itself as separate things. So yeah, I appreciate you sort of, not sort of, for you connecting that. Yeah. So I guess we can hop to the next question, which is, so tell me about the Alliance's beginnings. When was the need for it essentially realized?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two organizations, the Climate Psychology Alliance of the UK, which was the founding organization. And to be honest, I don't have the exact date when that started. I'm tempted to say sometime in the last 15 years, but don't quote me on the exact number. And it was really quite prescient. They very much understood that a kind of behavioral understanding of the crisis was not going to be particularly effective. How come we can't get people to change their consumption habits? How come we can't get people to change their transportation habits? All of those different kinds of things. That they understood that there were deeper issues there that were interfering with people's ability to emotionally process what was happening in the world. And so it started in a psychoanalytic depth psychology orientation. And I think what basically happened is that there were people who were doing a lot of really very important writing in the UK. and wanted to connect with people in the United States who were also doing very similar writing in the US context. Elizabeth Allred comes to mind, Anthony Wilson in Canada comes to mind, and there's others. And that became sort of a little bit of a shell of, again, depth psychology, trying to grapple with these issues. That was, I think, about 5 years ago. Again, don't quote me on the exact dates. But it truly was, in terms of it becoming a much larger organization, I think since or within the pandemic. And so there has been a kind of tidal wave shift, to use an apt metaphor, in the volume and the intensity and the reach of what CPA North America is trying to do. And we didn't quite expect it to go that fast. I remember when the term climate anxiety kind of started making itself known, and there's a lot of things to say about that term, but nevertheless, it popularized something so quickly that our membership grew very fast, our need to do programming increased very fast, and it kind of tumbled into more work, which we're actually still trying to catch up on and trying to understand what is our place in trying not to duplicate efforts out there and to really reach a need. So I would say in the United States in particular, it took off with this degree of intensity in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that also goes to my other question, which was, have you seen an uptick in demand of the Alliance's services since the pandemic? I think the pandemic has sort of exposed a lot of cracks in our society. And in terms of climate change, we've seen the worst wildfires, some of the worst flooding, heat stress, just a lot of compounding issues. So I guess my question to you is, what are you seeing people specifically ask for? What are people specifically needing with sort of this uptick in demand?
Oof, that's a great question. I think I would break it down into two different categories, or maybe even three. The first one is at the individual level. We are still a society that does not do community mental health care well. We're a society that has profoundly segregated and poor access to mental health care. We're a society that does not think about mental health in conjunction with institutional and systemic issues very well. It tends to become very individualized and very relational. So there's real problems in the mental health system in the United States in terms of how it frames issues and to whom it gets care and all of that. And with that, though, there still is a centrality of work at the individual level. And I would say, as we've gotten bigger, more clinicians are hearing of us and are realizing that they too want to be part of a climate solution, try to address it with the skills that they have and trying to repurpose their skills. So we're getting a lot more clinicians. And also, as climate anxiety gets in the news, we are getting a lot more referrals. And again, I don't think individual referrals are necessarily the measure of anxiety or distress out there, nor the way to address it necessarily. But that is one manifestation, that there are more and more people coming to individual therapy, naming the climate crisis as a big part of what they're dealing with. I know for myself, somebody asked the other day, who's the typical climate client? And there really is no typical climate client. They are young people wondering about whether or not to have children. In fact, one couple is breaking up because they have decided one wants to and the other doesn't because of the climate crisis. I have another person who quit her job being a midwife because she felt like she did not want to bring children into this world. I have other people in job crises where they want to leave their job, but are panicked because of how it's going to play out on their families and they can't pay the bills. I have another woman who's was undocumented and was trying to get across the border and was panicked both because of anti-immigrant hysteria and the climate crisis and felt utterly dropped and ignored by government institutions, if not stigmatized and blamed. So there's really, it goes on. And then even more as the fires and the smoke increased here on the East Coast, at least, the ambient anxiety that was not necessarily named as climate related is starting to be named as climate related, even by clients who are not coming for that purpose. And they're wondering about their sense of malaise. They're wondering about their sense of despair. They're wondering about sort of why are they feeling a sense of dread or anxiety that they can't name? And of course, there's lots of reasons for that, including anti-democracy. I mean, we have unfortunately way too many interrelated reasons to be feeling that way, but in particular, climate has been coming up a lot more, certainly on the East Coast.
Right.
And I think that that's likely true. I can't imagine not being true down in the South and the Southwest, and certainly in California. So it's coming up in that context. The other way it's coming up is that organizations, particularly climate-focused organizations, whether they're activist-oriented or otherwise, are beginning to be very aware of the stress on their own staff and their own team. And activist organizations are beginning to feel the stress, wondering what the strategy is to address this as they feel more and more like the issue is on their shoulders. And so we are getting much more outreach to provide care, an analytic frame, a way to understand what's happening in the world. And that's happening through a lot of different organizations, including news organizations. How do we hold and understand this in a way that people don't feel utterly hopeless, realistic, but not utterly hopeless, and at the same time find ways to regenerate, which is part of your last question. So organizations are tapping us for a lot more. And then I would say news organizations are reading the writing on the wall, both of their staff, but also the world, and are asking questions about mental health a little bit more. So that's also increasing. So I would say frontline climate workers, individuals, and journalists. And I think that's only going to get more and more intense as we develop more and more ways of connecting with people and providing care and access.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think one of the things that I think that has helped me as a climate journalist and someone who was a organizer was, I think in my reporting, I think really trying to focus on the solutions, because I think often I do get a lot of pitches on stories that are just about the climate dread and the disaster. And I'm like, yes, I think that is important to highlight. But also, what are some of the grassroots solutions? What are some of the policy solutions? And so, I'm grateful for organizations such as like the Solutions Journalism Network that does a lot of that coverage, or that's their whole sort of ecosystem, and other newsrooms sort of shifting. And even myself on the climate justice desk, like really focusing on that justice aspect. And I think for the first time, I think folks are actually realizing, I mean, I can say upfront that organizing work is very underpaid and undervalued. And I think for the first time, unfortunately, due to the climate crisis and sort of these compounding issues, people are actually seeing and recognizing how important organizing is. And even though sometimes it may be informal and sometimes formal, like having that as an actual like job title, realizing that, nothing really happens, I think, without that sort of momentum. So I think, despite it being recognized in this context, I think we're finally getting the sort of spotlight that this type of work really is important. So I don't know, just thinking about that. Yeah. So I guess, so just not to focus on your work, but to focus on you, because you are the person, that you're the co-president of the Alliance. And I know your email inbox is probably inundated and long, and your to-do list is probably never ending. So curious, how are you sort of handling the responsibility of, being the person or the organization that folks are now turning to? So what are you doing for self-care and joy? How are you taking care of yourself?
Well, to the first question, it's an honor, actually, Um, I have always been a social and political activist and always moved around large institutional and systemic issues. That's been part of how I identify with my place in the world, is to address those issues. And I also was part of I really believe in the interpersonal, and I really believe in the relational, and I really struggled at different times to go from that larger macro place to the place of intimacy and individual relationships and individual work, because I think that they're really dialectically related. I don't think that there's a huge, bright separation.
Mhm.
And so, to be honest, the really good thing about being in this role is that I finally get to bring those parts of myself together in a way that feels far more authentic and far more responsive to the way I see the world. And that feels lucky. That feels incredibly lucky. And it's also really sustaining. It's very different from other kinds of activism I've done, whether it's strikes or arrests or whatever, those kinds of things, all of which I'm very familiar with and have been part of. But it feels really, really vital, nevertheless. And I know that people use this phrase all the time, climate turn anxiety into action. But it's actually, in this case, really, really true, is that I could not imagine living at this moment in the world and not feel as though I was doing something real, something meaningful. Will I ever see its outcome? No. But I couldn't imagine living with myself or my children or my community or the world if I weren't doing something about that. It's too much part of who I identify as. And so this also addresses my own anxiety, my own distress. And that's really real. That said, we are right now an all volunteer organization. We are in the middle of some growing fundraising efforts, in part around the Trauma Informed Climate Journalism Project, which I'd be happy to talk about, but it's not sustainable at a voluntary level. It's absorbing huge amounts of my time and the time of a lot of other people, my co-president, Barbara Easterlin. So we are definitely needing resources. We're definitely writing grants. We're definitely developing a development program, all of those kinds of things. But in addition, and it's funny, not funny, that I was literally just talking about self-care with somebody this morning who has been devoted to climate adaptation work and climate resiliency work as a scientist nearly all of her adult life. And she was asking, how do we take care of ourselves? And I find the work of Sarah Jaquette Ray really quite helpful, and have taken it very much to heart, that we need to be motivated by love. We need to be motivated by what we care most about on the planet. And we need to be able to access the places where we feel spacious and open. And for me, that's taking long walks. I do a lot of pottery. I do a lot of photography. I think it's essential that I tap into the parts of myself that feel grounded in what I love most in the world. And that to me is varied for everybody. I don't think that there's any one way to do that, but I think it's absolutely essential. And I am building in more and more time for that as I get more intensely involved. So, and I would recommend that for everybody, and I do in my individual work, et cetera. That's a key part of the work is how to feel like that's not only necessary, but vital for ourselves, for other people, in building the movement and staying in it for the long haul, sticking with the problem for the long haul.
Got it. So making room for spaciousness and doing things that feel grounded. Got it. Yep. I love that. So
grounded in what you love, like whether that's music or whatever it is, to make sure you keep those in your life, that they are priority in your life, not an afterthought.
Right. Yeah. I think it's easy to get so caught up in just work and like the constant need to feel like you need to produce something that yeah, I feel like even in this space, sometimes even hobbies, you're like, oh, well, how can I monetize this? Or should I be monetizing this? Or should I be like putting this out when it should really just be for you? And I think that's often a constant pressure that myself and I know many other people deal with. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes our current society doesn't really allow for that at all. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Adrienne Marie Brown on her, do you see her Instagram account?
Yes, love, yes, yes,
I
big
love
fan of
her
her
so
work.
much.
Hmm.
And she had a meme the other day that said, me, then also me. And the me was, I really need to learn how to relax and take care
Hmm.
of myself. And then it said, also me, I'm wondering how I can relax more productively.
Hmm.
It's just,
Hmm.
it's that, it's that,
It's hard.
it's that grind.
Yeah.
It's, and we need permission from those who we love and who care about the same things to give us room to do that.
Hmm.
To have around us people who really value that kind of space, which
Right.
is one of the difficulties in the activist world, I think, and probably in the journalist world. And I'm sure
Yeah,
anyone who gets very involved in these
for
issues.
sure. So, speaking of journalism, please tell me about the Trauma Informed Climate Journalism Project. What's happening?
Well, a lot is happening, and you were sort of witness to the beginning of it.
Hmm.
And I really do. I credit a couple of people, especially Amy Westervelt, and someone who is a little bit off-site, who's in my organization, named Liliana, where we sort of have been hobbling around this idea and recognition that the field of climate communication is essential, but tends to be very information heavy and statistics heavy. And um, I think people are working very hard around messaging of climate. I think that there's a general understanding that people don't respond well to um, doomsday headlines.
Yeah.
But there's not lots and lots of models about how to do something different, particularly in a clickbait heavy, profit driven journalism world.
Hmm.
Um, and so we began thinking about it first as a way to try to introduce psychological ideas and understandings of trauma in the reporting world. How are the articles affecting people and getting active in the world? That was, it started as that. My interest in understanding the doom that people are coming in with in my office, understanding how we can move people out of overwhelm into creative action. Those questions really animated it and got me thinking quite a bit about climate journalism generally. And then Liliana was saying, what is it like to be a journalist whose articles, for all sorts of reasons, are expected to conform to these kinds of narratives,
Hmm.
or they don't give enough time to really delve into solutions in an effective way. And so it got us to thinking about the role of what is the newsroom like? How are journalists experiencing having to report these things, but then living in their lives around a lot of people who don't read the work because of news avoidance,
Yeah.
or family members who don't want to hear it. So they're becoming sort of isolated Cassandras in their own world. And that's a terribly isolating place to be. I used to work in the field much more around sexual assault and sexual abuse, and people would ask me what I do. And I would name what I do, and the conversation would stop. And or I'm so glad you're doing that work, but it didn't do anything to help me express what I'm seeing in the world or live with what I'm seeing. And I think that climate journalists are in that bind quite a bit, whether on TV or radio or in print. So it was also wanting to take care of you. um, and then I think that what's happening with it that's so exciting is that our work with Solutions Journalism Network and Uproot is deepening.
Hmm.
Uh, that hasn't stopped since the SEJ conference. So we are imagining actually creating a genuine project in a collaborative way that could include a survey of journalists about what they need. We're starting to give presentations with SJN about trauma-informed journalism, about how to represent communities in a way that doesn't flatten their experience of trauma. And I remember your question to SEJ actually about sort of the climate justice aspects of these things and the reporting. And a lot of the work is going into how do we really deepen and embody the people who are continuing to live in so-called disaster zones. Like, do we represent them as just completely flattened and not taking steps to address their own lives in ways that feel very deeply rooted in their own histories, et cetera?
Right.
How do we do that in a way that makes people feel like they're alive, and not just these inert victims of circumstance? So all of that is starting to come forward, with SJN, with Uproot. It's all at the beginning stages. But it's, to me, tremendously exciting. And there's beginning to be buy-in that this needs to happen, at least within the SJN world, and how that needs to be woven into our understanding of solutions about connecting on the ground, addressing social and emotional aspects, connecting to not only trauma or layered trauma, but in a much more meaningful sense, layered survival and thriving. I hesitate to use the word resilience because it's such a troubling word. But so the work is going forward, and it's super exciting.
That is exciting. Yeah, I'm excited to see how it also, continues to take shape, and glad to hear. Yeah, glad to hear Uproot, of course, and SJN as part of it. Two great organizations, so that I'm part of. Yeah, so awesome.
Yes.
So I wanted to know, yeah, I guess I sort of asked this already, but I asked it towards you, but how are you sort of with your clients that you, and yeah, I'll say your clients that you are, helping and talking with and seeing hopefully on a regular basis, how are you sort of telling them to prioritize rest and wellness? How crucial do you think rest and wellness really is in this point in time?
I think I know the answer you're wanting me to give, but I think I'm gonna give more than one. I think for some clients, the urgency is to give them room to act on the things that they see going around them. There's a lot of barriers, internal barriers, and the language of professionalism barriers that prevent people from accessing the emotions that they're feeling about climate. And so part of it is actually urging them to feel those feelings. They're not irrational. They are vital to understanding that we need, in fact, to be active in the world. And so part of it is to provide enough space and support to validate and amplify feelings that are already there. So that doesn't automatically lead to rest. In some ways it might lead to more, how do I get involved? How do I get out? And that's actually one of the goals, right? For others, namely activists or people who go the other way. So some people kind of block it out and kind of numb themselves because they don't have ways to access or act on those feelings in their worlds for all sorts of reasons. Again, whether it's professional identity or personal identity or responsibilities or everything else, or political identities, where they block it out. So the goal is actually to bring it forward.
Right.
For others who are so hypervigilant and somewhat tortured in their day-to-day life about never doing enough, never feeling like they can relax, always feeling like they need to contribute just a little bit more to the solution. For those people, absolutely the emphasis is how to recognize when you need to access other parts of yourself, and how to address the fear of what that means, how to address the identity about what it means to relax, to take time off, to enjoy buying something that you know is going to have a carbon footprint, or all of those other kinds of things. And in some ways, getting out of the individualist model of the movement, that we are much, much, much larger than just what we do in a 24/7 segment of time. And that we might not always see the results of our work. And that's where Sarah Jaquette Ray's work in her book is really, really wonderful about giving us ways to think about success and joy and love in a slightly larger scope.
Mm-hmm.
We live in an economy and in a society that is so rapid and so quick and so results oriented, understandably around climate, but it also makes it very difficult to recognize that there's value in something other than what we can see immediately.
Mm-hmm.
That we're contributing to a larger cultural shift as much as anything. And I also then think about ways in which we think about activism to emphasize relationship, to emphasize connection to people, not individualist consumption-oriented work or anything else. And I think that when you flip it a little bit into what does count as productive action,
Mm-hmm.
it can also lead you to collective ways of being active, which can then settle some of that hyper aware nervous system that is being activated all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. I think just going back to, yeah, I think just allowing people to sort of explore other versions of themselves and sort of helping people realize that they're more than their labor. And,
Yes, exactly.
yeah, I think that's important. And I think one thing that you has said at the beginning of your answer was interesting in terms of looking at how we sort of, I guess that I'll put it in my own words, redefine activism. And I think that's one thing that's really important. I think about journalism, especially climate journalism. I think that I started writing because it was, I think, just having a lot of stories, I think, from folks in the movement and the work that they were doing, I think was naturally kind of the stories that I wanted to tell and ended up writing. Um, and so, yeah, I just often think about movement journalism as a concept that's sort of central to my work, and a lot of folks that I really appreciate that are also journalists and editors. So, yeah, yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Can you tell me a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about what you think is movement journalism? I would love to know a little bit more about what that looks like or includes.
Yeah. So it started in the South, and an organization that does a lot of their work is called Press On. Um, they're sort of a liberatory collective in the South focused on movement journalism. And so I think also the Craig Newmark School focuses on that too in their social journalism program. I think that's the name of it. But anyway, it's sort of centering the most impacted communities and figuring out how your reporting can serve them. So instead of reporting on them, you report with and for them. And so that's sort of course, you can't do that all the time. Sometimes you actually just need to file a story and get it published. But I think movement journalism has always been the kind of work that I think that I do, and what I hope to continue to do in my time as a journalist in whatever, capacity that may be.
I'm really moved and excited to hear about the way you're talking about movement journalism. And one of the things that's coming to mind in that context is that in a number of places where I've started speaking with journalists in larger group contexts, whether it's at NPR or major climate newspapers or whatever, is the feeling that if they use or rely on their emotions or have emotions as they're reporting, that is somehow illegitimate, or that they're being too activist. And it bumps up against, I think, beginning to be antiquated, but still pretty heavily pronounced notions of professionalism in a very sort of macho big newsroom culture. And that's come up a lot about what are the boundaries. And I think it came up in the SEJ conference too.
Mhm.
What are the boundaries between being very engaged and very connected to issues that matter to all of us as
Right.
people, living in systems of racism and inequity and climate? How are we expected to report on those things without having an emotional reaction, without being part of wanting a solution? And I think that challenges again the boundaries between journalism and living in the world. That happens constantly in my work as a
Mhm.
clinician. And I think it's actually part of our witnessing obligation, actually, to bring those things into the space, to name them, to address them, to
Right.
define professionalism in a way that allows those to be part of what it means to be a good journalist, what it means to be a good clinician. And I'm not saying pour ourselves all over our story, but I am saying that use the feelings, use the reactions, use the experience as a way to connect to the people we're talking to, and as a way of showing that we actually have skin in the game, quite
Yeah.
literally, on these issues. And again, I know that attacks some sacred cows, but clearly not to you.
Mhm.
In the concepts of
Yeah.
movement, how to do that ethically and with an appropriate sense of boundary and connection, I think is very much part of what this work should include.
Yeah, I think that's one of the privileges I think in my journalism journey thus far, and even here at MPQ, and being the climate justice the senior editors being able to do that. Um, and I appreciate sort of being able to build out the desk to do that sort of work. And I think two publications that I often think about that do this quite awesomely is Scallywag magazine. They're based in the South. I think their whole thing is movement journalism. And I think about Southerly magazine. They're not operating right now. They actually closed up shop this year, but they
Mm.
do have a community. Yeah. It was really sad to see that, but I think their editor in chief has something else coming. But yes, Scallywag and Southerly magazine, I think, are two publications that really, really sort of embody that movement journalism
Mm.
framing to me, in my opinion. Yeah.
Well,
So,
and I think thank you for that. And I think again, you're raising, this is so, the overlap is so important, because I think another piece, and I think this is also beginning to break down, is talking about what is the relationship or what is the responsibility of journalists
mhm,
to take care of the audience they are reaching and the people about whom they're reporting. And when we frame things as just the facts, the hard-hitting facts, that's framing things in extremely limited ways. Facts are a lot of things. Facts include emotional reactions. Facts include social justice. Facts include impact. And I would especially say in this context around climate journalism, we have to be aware of how we report, how that impacts people's sense of capacity to take action and capacity to be part of the larger movement. If people feel like it's over and done, or if they feel like the systemic process is so massive that there's no point of intervention, then what's the point of the journalism in the first place? So again, I know that raises questions about traditional journalism, but clearly not for you. I mean, obviously,
mhm.
you've given your life to thinking about those questions, and I admire that. Obviously, I admire it tremendously.